Planning Commission podcast is a spirited discussion with myself and a couple of my longtime colleagues in the profession. Our discussions are based solely on our own opinions and do not reflect the opinions or views of our employers, the American Planning Association, or even our alma maters. So grab a seat in the back of City Hall, dig out an old copy of Robert's Rules, and for goodness sakes, read your packet. The Planning Commission is now in session.
Welcome, everybody, to a special edition of the Planning Commission podcast. Today is going to be quite an episode. It's one we've been looking forward to for quite some time. Today's episode is about a subject that is pretty serious, and it's one in an area and a topic that we as planners need to be honest and explore more, and frankly, peel these layers back and get to the truth of things. Today's episode is going to be about environmental justice. And before we get too ahead of ourselves, something just to remind our listeners and all of you who've been with us from the beginning. When we first started this kind of crazy idea, the three of us started to come up with titles for our potential episodes. And before we knew it, I think we had 30 plus titles that just ran the gamut of all kinds of things. But one of the common themes of those titles was truth, was not being shy about the stuff that we know is right or wrong with our profession. And our objective from day one has been to really right the wrongs, whatever that might mean. And so we've done our best, and we're going to continue to do our best to have discussions like today and really, again, be as honest as we can with you about what's going on and how we see things in this profession. So today, buckle up, grab our hand, lean in, listen a little bit harder, because I think it's going to be worth your time to do so. Today's episode's title is called People of Color, Red Lines, and White Flight, because we're going to get pretty serious and we're going to jump into this pool. So thank you for joining us. We also have a special commissioner amongst us, a familiar face, Tara Crawford. Thank you for being on with us today. So, fellow commissioners, welcome back. I have a question to ask you to kick us off. In light of this episode of the topic of environmental justice and everything that we know it to mean, question. Can you think of a recent occurrence in your career that you've experienced firsthand that kind of shows that, man, we still have a long way to go and we're not there yet, right? Maybe it's not the obvious, maybe it's more subtle, but if anything comes to mind, I'd love for you to share that. So I'll just jump off with this just so that you have a chance to think about it. I was working in a community recently where we were going all over the place, and it was very obvious to me the neighborhoods in a rather large city that needed help. And this particular city was launching a traffic calming program, which I think is great. I think all of us would agree is a good thing. Here was the problem. The public outreach meeting was held at City Hall at 4:00 at downtown. And you're just going, I knew because of the people I was working with. I told him when we first found out about it, which was, I think, around 10 in the morning that day, I predicted who's going to be there. It's so obvious. It's not a magic trick. It's pretty painful, in fact. So we showed up. Lo and behold, what a shock. The room was full of people that looked a whole lot like me. And that's not necessarily the representation that we needed at that meeting. And I think it's an example, right, of maybe somebody thought it was a good idea. Hey, City Hall, centrally located. But the truth of the matter is that ain't moving the needle, right? And so we got to get better. So what do you think, Don, Tara, Jess, any examples?
Well, I'll go. Prior to moving back to Idaho, I had been back closer to where I grew up in North Carolina and living in Asheville. And the state DOT was proposing to widen I-240 in Asheville. And it was a highway that was built through redlining and all of that. And it was essentially seen as a doubling down on that, and literally $400 million of property acquisition that was primarily Black-owned houses and Black-owned businesses And one, not only was it a doubling down, two, it was again a removal of wealth from that community and a well-established one. And then even worse, when we get into the environmental document and through the federal processes, they talk about, a community of concern and environmental justice. And their only mitigation measure was more public involvement, which I took to mean we're going to give you more opportunities to tell you exactly how we're going to do things. And my hopes are with things like that, with the new transportation bill and all the talk of those things, that we would go back and revisit those things, because myself working with the neighborhood and some other advocates was just trying to ask the feds to allow a smaller footprint for that project. And they still wouldn't do it, despite those issues and despite the other justifications and despite examples being brought in from other states where they had done that. And again, it's like, so despite NEPA, despite environmental justice executive order, here's essentially this doubling down on what had happened, 5 or 6 decades prior.
So you mean to tell me that easels and foam core boards, more of those isn't going to solve taking someone's home?
Yeah, we're going to buy more
I'm
dots.
So confused. Tara, it sounds like you might have something.
Yes, thank you. So before I go into it, I just want to give a textbook definition of what environmental justice is. It's basically
do.
the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, ethnicity, income, national origin, or educational level, with respect to any kind of development, implementation, or enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. A lot of people tend to mix up Title VI and environmental justice. So environmental justice is specifically in regards to, like I said, minority and low income specifically. So dealing with transit, I've been at a couple of agencies. So I actually have a more positive story where, again, we're mindful of Title VI and environmental justice. So, the main thing with transit is that we subsidize a lot of our services. So if a service isn't doing good, it's whether or not you want to truncate or remove that route completely or modify it or something else. So when I was working in South Florida for Broward County Transit, we had one of our express routes that was not performing well for a number of years prior to COVID. And so what we did, we actually worked with the Florida Department of Transportation down there. We did extensive public involvement. We coordinated, we looked at the data, and then we actually did the due diligence by going out into the actual neighborhoods. We went to all the park and rides a number of times. We talked to the people. We notated all of the comments. We coordinated with them, let them know that one, we are going to discontinue the route. It was different. So it was the express route. So these were people that were affluent, so they're high income, but then they're also heavily minority, Hispanic and or Black, and so, but because we did that due diligence by doing all the public involvement, talking to people, and we gave them ample notice, people were able to, because they liked our service so much, people were able to, we found other ways for people to get down from Southern Broward County into Miami-Dade. We coordinated with other park and rides that they were close to. Some people even moved their daycares because, if they have children, they hadn't time to find daycares closer to other park and rides. So it was a success. And so I think that you can do environmental justice right in regards to transit and making those difficult decisions to provide efficient service to people.
Yeah, that's a good one. And daycare, man, that's something, especially in the last 10 years, that's been talked quite a bit about, right? Like we got to do a better job of figuring it's not just easy to hop out to some sort of a meeting somewhere and call it good. And the expectation of us as planners probably should be different on that, right? Jess, anything to add on that?
Just real briefly, what I want to talk about when we think about a little bit different side of this, when we think about equality or equity, and being two different things, but on actually the physical space that we give to different modes on our roads. So I was thinking about something that Chris and Don actually have a training workshop they do called Hourglass or Glass Door. Looking Glass. I'm sorry, I'm going Hourglass, Glass, Looking Glass. And in Looking Glass, we try to look at helping folks understand what it's like to walk in their own city, right? And for lack of a
Mhm.
better, that's a quick and dirty description of that. And one of the things that we use in those workshops are a hula hoop to show personal space that you kind of need to walk in. And a hula hoop regulation is 35 inches. I just Googled it. So if somebody knows better, let me know. So that's 35 inches. And so 2 hula hoops. And if you look at like what are specs for a sidewalk or a walkway, what we're looking for is for 2 adults to walk comfortably beside each other. So if you take 2 hula hoops, that's 70 inches, and that's if hula hoops are touching, right? So, okay, now we got some good space. And if you think about 70 inches, that is not quite 6 feet, right? And a standard sidewalk, and I'm saying standard with a broad, loose term, you know, 'cause it's different for different cities and DOT. But
It's not as different as you think. It's pretty standardized in zoning
Well,
codes and
yeah.
everything
well,
else. Yeah.
right. And we
Bare
look,
minimum, right?
right. And your minimum you look at a lot of times is about 5 feet. So 5 feet is 60 inches. 2 hula hoops is 70 inches. So already we're cramped and uncomfortable. And so then I think about who is using that sidewalk. It's not just 2 adults walking next to each other. I'm thinking about someone with an assistive device. I think about mamas with their strollers. I think about dog walkers. I'm sitting in downtown San Diego right now, and I'm looking out my window, and they've got these big, fabulous sidewalks downtown, but they're really not that big, maybe 10 feet. They've got a bunch of signs. They've got light bulbs and things in them. And I'm seeing people walk their dogs, and there's a ton of them. I've seen 10 dog walkers come by, and it's 11 o'clock in the morning on a Friday. So what are we doing here? Because I'm also looking out, and there's 3 one-way lanes that are, these are good, these are probably 10 and 12-foot lanes. And so we will give a 12-foot lane for cars, but the average car width is 5.8 feet. So we're giving more than double
Yeah.
for a car, which is a metal box, but we can't give more than, we can't even give double for a human walking down our sidewalk. So that's one of those things that just sort of blows my mind from just a physical standpoint. Why do we do that?
Yeah.
And why does that make sense?
Defaulting to the bare minimum, right?
Yeah.
When we don't do the minimum for other facets of the transportation system or
Also, where did that minimum come from? I mean, just like made that up.
Texas
So,
A&M. That's my guess.
100%.
On that note, so Don, let's change gears because I definitely want to get to our guest today. What do you got for our whiskey pairing?
Yeah, so in researching this on the topic, I came across an organization out of Atlanta called the Black Bourbon Society, and they have been working for a few years to work with the spirits industry on a lot of diversity programs and things. And their message has been very pointed. This is more about social media posts on commitment to equity and other things. And I was impressed with what the company Brown-Forman, which owns Old Forester and Jack Daniels and Woodford Reserve, as well as others, came out. And they said this, and I thought, and go back to your theme, Chris, about the truth. We have a lot to learn internally. We want to show up, but we just don't know how. And that struck me as being so aligned with the planning profession, where I think there's an acknowledgement of it, but I don't know, when we look at our comprehensive plans, our land use plans, our transportation plans, and all those things, we might use the word equity or environmental justice in a vision, but I would say it's not used as an informative piece of all the things through there. So I just thought that, one, refreshing. They kind of just admitted the true, we want to know about this, but we're going to admit we're not the experts on it. So with that, I went with a Brown-Forman product with the Jack Daniels triple mash on that side.
Triple mash. All right.
Just
Well
keep
done.
saying.
I like that. I like that. That's things are definitely changing in certain ways, but as we've discussed, we've got a long way to go. So thank you for that. Appreciate it. All right. So with that, we're going to introduce our guest. I've had the good fortune of working with Mr. Charles Brown, who's the founder and CEO of Equitable Cities, in a recent project. And I think it sounds like we might have another opportunity here shortly to do a little more collaboration in some projects. Can't wait for that. But in the meantime, we're going to ask Mr. Brown some questions. So Charles, good to have you on the Planning Commission podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's just start with some of the basics. If we can, just give our audience a little bit about who you are, your background, and how you really came to start, and why maybe you started the Equitable Cities.
Wow, I'm beyond 35 now, so we'll start with like one question at a time, right? So I'll remember what the other questions were. So again, welcome everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. I go by Charles T. Brown. I identify as a cisgendered, heterosexual, Black Christian male. I was born and reared in a small town in rural Mississippi called Sugar Lock, Mississippi, which is roughly 500 people total. I'm currently based in Somerset, New Jersey, but I'm fortunate to live, work, and play all over the world. I'm the husband of Lataska Brown. I'm the father of Christian, Layla, and Camden Brown, and I'm the son of Deborah and Willie C. McNeese. And as it relates to Willie C. McNeese, my father, certainly may he rest in peace. Professionally, I'm the founder and CEO of Equitable Cities, which is an urban planning, public policy, and research firm. We have collectively a dozen plus years of experience across transportation planning, policy, and research, both quantitative and qualitative, working with federal, state, regional, and local governments throughout North America. That includes both transportation and health, as well as climate and energy. I'm the host of the Arrested Mobility podcast. I'm also an adjunct professor at Rutgers University, the State University of New Jersey. I started my career, real humble beginnings. I wanted to be an architect to start, but I quickly learned that it wasn't houses that I wanted to design or buildings. What I really wanted to design were cities that allowed everyone to have an opportunity to reach their full potential. And so I was fortunate, while getting an associate's degree actually in drafting and design in Mississippi, I was recruited by an all-Black engineering firm to come and work as a roadway designer for them while continuing my education. And while there, a colleague of mine mentioned urban studies. And at the time, I'd never heard of urban studies, let alone urban planning. But to kind of take you back now and to date myself, and I'm not that old, I went to AOL, and it was a dial-up service, I think, at the time.
I can still hear that.
Right,
in my
I can
head,
still
right?
hear it. And I typed in urban planning, and when I read the description for urban planning, I was like, yo, this is what I've been looking for my entire life. And so I started to transition my career to focus less on the design aspect of transportation, to focus more on what I deem the social aspects of the work we do, which is urban planning. That led me to working for that firm, IMS Engineers. If you're out there, thank you for that first opportunity. I worked for them for about 5+ years while pursuing my education. I then transitioned to CPH Engineers, which is based in Florida. At the time, I was working in DeLand, Florida. I worked there as a roadway designer as well. And then while at the University of Central Florida, UCF, go Knights, I was pursuing a degree in public administration and planning, a master's degree. And I bumped into someone who was working at the city of Orlando. And I assisted her with her GIS exercise because I'd had a background in GIS as well. And that led to ultimately me getting a job in planning at the city of Orlando, where I worked there for about 3+ years. And then while living in Orlando for a total, at that point, about 6 years, I was listening to the radio, and Beyonce's husband said, if you can make it in New York City, you can make it anywhere. And I was offended. I was offended by that statement because I was like, who is this guy? If you can make it in Mississippi, you can make it anywhere. And so I started pursuing opportunities in the Northeast because I wanted to test and see if indeed what he was saying was true. And what I've come to find after being here for 11 plus years is that both things are true. They're just opposite ends of the spectrum. And so I worked for 11 years. I ended up moving to the Northeast to work for Rutgers University, where I oversaw a bike ped resource center focused on planning, policy, and research throughout the state of New Jersey. And then I failed to mention during this entire journey, I served in the US military as well. So that's a little about me.
I love it. Thanks, Charles. The one thing that I'm always fascinated about is how people became a planner, and you kind of walked us through that. But I know that when I think back about growing up, now things are the dots are starting to connect about how I ended up in planning and how that was kind of foreboding this whole time, if you will. Are there things that you think of when you're growing up or even as a teenager? What was it that you look back and you go, all right, yeah, I was always going to be a planner?
Yeah, so I didn't have a vocabulary at the time to know or the knowledge of the field of planning. But to your point, when I look back, looking back with 2020 vision, I can always see that I was always a guy that was about justice. In elementary school, they asked you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And for me at the time, I wanted to be the head of the FBI. And so I would say, hey, I want to be the head of the FBI.
Yeah.
That is ultimately what led me to going to the military. And ultimately now, which I look back, played a pivotal role in me choosing planning and focusing specifically on justice within planning. And just to kind of take you through some key moments throughout my career, which helped shape me to get where I'm at today, it really started with growing up in a really small town, a rural town, where we didn't have any sidewalks. We didn't have any bike lanes. We didn't have any traffic signals or transit of any sort. And so I can recall my mother deciding to send me to the city, which at the time was Columbus, Mississippi, a town of less than maybe it's about 30,000. I'll give Columbus a shout out. Maybe it's about 30,000. And I would spend summers with my cousins in the quote unquote city. And I could see the stark differences between my rural environment, which was 30 miles away from them, and their more urban one. They had McDonald's, which as a kid was huge. They had Walmart and some of these other stores. And we had to travel about 10 to 15 minutes away from my town just to get basic services. And so I would always wonder, like, why are their towns so different than ours? The other thing that did it for me was my love for Chick-fil-A. Don't judge me.
I mean,
so while at the University of Central Florida, I was in my GIS class. And by this time, I'm a skilled tactician in GIS because I've been working 6 years. So this class was just, an elective that I had to do. But anyway, I used GIS to solve a question I always had. Why was there no Chick-fil-A in my hood? and so I started researching Chick-fil-A's to figure out, like, why are there no Chick-fil-A's where I'm living in Florida? And so this was when, really humble beginnings. There was no Chick-fil-A, but I noticed there was a Church's Chicken, there was a KFC, they were all there, but no Chick-fil-A. So I used GIS to map every Chick-fil-A in the state of Florida. And I overlaid the location of these Chick-fil-A's on census data, looking at demographic data like race, income, et cetera. And what I found was I wasn't living in an affluent neighborhood, or I wasn't living in, more specifically, a neighborhood that met the median household, the average household income in the state of Florida. This was very disheartening and concerning, as you can imagine, because I identified to begin with as a Christian. But I noticed Chick-fil-A was not where I thought Jesus would have been, which is in the hood. The only exception to that rule was Chick-fil-A's were located in malls, which what I've come to find out were developments of regional impact, right? So you had people of all incomes coming into the mall, which is why you might have seen a Chick-fil-A there. So
the only place they'd look at foot traffic to justify.
That's the only place
location.
they'll look at foot traffic. Exactly. So those are the things that really shaped my career. I could go on and on, but those are two highlights.
Thank you so much.
So I just look at that like I used to say, like curiosity killed the transportation planner as a joke of all these holes I dive down into. So I've got another great example from someone for doing that. That's great.
So I think Tara's got a question she's going to ask you.
Okay.
So thank you, Charles. So my question is, can you please help us define what environmental justice is? Where is it rooted? What does it mean? And how has it changed over the decades?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm going to follow up with what you did and give you first the textbooks definition, and that is environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. And that's respect to the development, the implementation, the enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. When I think about what does that mean to me and how it has changed over the decades, I think it has a lot to do with how, first and foremost, a lot of us in planning have been socialized in our professional and in our public and in our personal lives as to when we hear income, for some reason, we think minority. We don't think about the many white people who are out there who fall underneath the protection of environmental justice. Instead, in planning, we think environmental justice is doing something solely for those Black and brown folk, another socialized program to benefit them and to burden white people or to blame white people for past decisions. I think that's one of the downsides as it relates to the ways in which we've approached this discussion around environmental justice. We need to teach all people, and in particular white people, that there happens to be a large proportion of our population that are disproportionate, well, not disproportionate, the absolute total number of people who are poorest in this country are white people, not Black and brown people. But when they hear income, they tend to think that this is a program just for Black people. So that's one way. I don't know if that has changed, but that is certainly something that we need to pay greater attention to. Another thing is the fact that we're not necessarily enhancing people's opportunity to participate when we talk about fair involvement. In fact, public engagement is really a formality in planning. They're not hiring companies that reflect the communities that they're trying to target. And then many people have the audacity to say we're hard to reach. We're hard to reach because you were never forced to interact with us. We all live in these bubbles. And then when it comes time to engage with people of whom we can't socially identify with, we give them labels such as hard to reach, hard to understand, difficult, and things of that nature. So I think public participation in the decision-making process is something that needs to change, and it hasn't changed. And lastly, I think the prevention of these disproportionate impacts. We still continue and allow, to a great degree, Black, brown, and low-income communities of all race to be impacted by our decision-making processes, and that's something we need to change. But ultimately, what you find within that, having said the thing about income, is that when you're talking about environmental justice in the context of America, both historically as well as presently, what you're really advocating for is racial equity. And many planners are starting to, or have had historically, an issue with advocating for racial equity because, again, some of them were thinking that you were doing something that was undeserving of people of color. And we have to work past that too.
Yeah, I like what you said at the beginning of that discussion. When I was back in North Carolina and looking at the state data for bicyclist and pedestrian crash victims, and it was always a factor of certainly the Black population in that state is grossly overrepresented in those figures. But it was also a thing of, when we're sitting there and we're looking at the unfortunate victim of a crash, it's easier to check the box on what we can view as their race or ethnicity, but we don't know their income. And I always felt that if we were to look at that data, we would find just for the white population as well, that by and large, those victims were probably of a lower income status as well. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I've often felt that's the case and would love to see more research on that topic. When we talk about our foundational elements and so much of what happens in planning, health, safety, general welfare, and all these things we trace back, where our foundational documents say we're all created equal. How does planning help foster that and bring that about to be a better place and be better things? And where do we still have room for improvement?
Yeah, that's a good question. First and foremost, I think it's important to understand my mindset is I didn't need any document to tell me that I'm equal. I think that's important. What we don't want to do is perpetuate this mindset of people feeling and acting as if they're less than. One of the fortunate things about growing up where I grew up in a predominantly Black area is that I always understood, the benefits of my skin color, not the burdens of it. I didn't ignore that, but I wasn't limited in my ability, nor did we give the control of anyone, that control over to anyone to limit our ability. So I take self-accountability for where I am today, despite the fact that all the things that we say historically are true. Racial discrimination, white supremacy still exists. I just don't want my brothers and sisters out there to use that as a reason to not excel and to not overcome and achieve. Because one thing we certainly are, people of color, we're resilient. And I think history has shown that too. So when we look at planning and we talk about the foundation of it and the fact that we're all created equal, but planning has prevented that for some populations. I think one thing we need to do in planning is frame things better, perhaps. Because for me, if we just say planning has prevented that, we are not assigning agency where agency is due in terms of responsibility. It's people, not planning. It's people that have racialized us. It's people who have decided to destroy our communities. It's people who have decided to deny access to everyday opportunities. It's people who have decided to ignore key elements of our history. It's people who are at universities who decide not to put that history or to incorporate that history in their teachings and in the learnings of students. And so what we know about those people is that unfortunately, a disproportionate share of those who have prevented that are white. And so what we should say then is not what has planning done, but what has a certain percentage of white people in this country who have controlled these planning processes done to communities of color, as well as low-income white communities throughout America. If we can get the language right, if we can get the diagnosis right, I think we can find a solution.
That reminds me, I know, Jess, you've responded to this before, of just if you just did a word search in some plans or corridor studies, how you wouldn't even find the word people.
Yeah, thank
in a
you
lot
so
of
much for saying the
Oh my
word
gosh.
people so many times in one long run-on sentence. I appreciated that very, very much.
That's
Yeah,
funny.
I mean, we can't use what we used to do in school, right? We say the dog ate my homework. I mean, that was still your homework. You were still responsible for that homework. And so in the case of planning, oftentimes we politicize our conversations. And I'm never one to blame any particular group unjustly. I mean, all you got to do is Google me. My friendship looks like the United Nations. But within those friendships, we assign, blame where blame is just and fair. And in this particular case, we just can't vaguely say planning is responsible. We got to call a spade, as we say in Black barbershops.
Well, I think about it too. We've done some housing analysis, and when we look at like the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act stuff, even at the top end of the income bracket, you see these disparities in there. And your statement about that is like there's people making that decision specifically at that level of institutions, which
Absolutely.
So I'm thinking about, as we're on this topic, and again, thank you for saying people. It's and when I talk to corporations about what to do with their employees. I use the word people and not employees. I mean, they are, but this organization is made of people. So we're celebrating Black History Month. It's February. And I am thinking about, as a planner and been doing this for a little bit, Charles, what would you say to planners in the profession today to, one, remember their history, all pieces of it, as you were talking about, not leaving out things that are uncomfortable or that we don't like, remembering our history, and then also, what can we learn from that history as planners, and what can we continue to do? What can we do more of? And what are some things, if you want to add to it, what are some things we need to not do that are not helping currently, in the past? It's a smorgasbord. You can answer this any way that kind of come
Yeah.
to mind.
No, you all are bringing the big questions here today, and I'm
Really?
really enjoying the conversation. I'll answer that question similar to the last one. I want to focus on what people can do. I'm not an advocate of forcing anything on anyone. I also don't believe that we need everyone to change in order for there to be change.
Mhm.
I believe that we need a very small, vocal, and willing minority that can shift the course of history, because history has proven that. When you have a very vocal, strong minority, usually change happens as long as they're persistent. And so what I want planners to understand is that they too should not be waiting on the Calgary to arrive, or cavalry in that particular way.
Yeah.
They should not be waiting on that to arrive to give them permission to
Mhm.
act in
Mhm.
regards to the pursuit of economic, social, and racial justice or equity. And the reason why I state this is because in the AICP ethics, it explicitly states people who participate in the planning process should work to achieve economic, social, and racial equity. The question is, why aren't planners, many of whom have AICPs, or many of whom are in pursuit of AICPs, not seeking social justice? What are they awaiting when they've already given the permission,
Yeah.
they have the guidance, and is in the code of ethics to actually do this? See, I was doing this work pre-George Floyd, and when I was doing this work, you can only imagine the looks that I was getting when I would say equity or justice. Now that, from a financial standpoint, many of these firms are benefiting from these terms, they want to have these conversations. My thing is, stand on something. I want planners to really stand for something. And my hope is that they stand for economic, social, and racial equity as their AICP ethics dictate.
I
We
think you're saying, like, bring it in at the front, because that's what your ethics dictate. Don't wait for advocates or neighborhoods or whatever other
Have some
overarching policy.
fortitude.
Yeah.
Have
We
some
are-
fortitude.
We
Have some
are the
fortitude.
cavalry. We are
But
the
we
cavalry.
are.
Stop
Yeah,
waiting. This
exactly.
is it. You're the
Exactly.
warriors. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
been
and so
amazing to me how people sit back and watch and wait, like you're saying, and I'm going, just do something.
do something. Even if you fail, at least you'll learn.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a problem with planners who sort of assimilate into these systems and forget why they came into planning to start. We all know that in our field, we are probably some of the most caring people out there. But unfortunately, and this goes back to that vocal minority I talked about, even when we're not on purpose, we tend to assimilate into a culture that continues to perpetuate inequities and injustices. And what I'm looking for are warriors who are willing to risk it all on behalf of other people. See, we do this work for people. We don't do it for clout. We don't do it for money. We don't do it for fame. I do it simply because I love and care about everybody, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their color, or national origin. I don't want to see anyone suffering. And I got into planning to prevent that.
Well said. And man, I'm going to just jump in real quick on here, because I'd be remiss if I didn't discuss. This was a topic of conversation amongst the three of us, specifically on AICP a couple months back. And I'm not going to get into all of the details, but it's a challenge. It really is at times because of what you said. And what does it mean? Does it mean something? I think going back to your point about, instead of castigating everything or everyone that has the word planner after their title, it's certainly much more individualistic than that, but to your point, yeah, right. Stand for something, right? I mean, Don and I once walked a neighborhood of color where this amazing park, and it was in North Carolina. I don't know if you remember this, Don, where they erected this fence to separate the neighborhood from this incredible park, and the fence was pushed down. And it's like, of course it's pushed down. People just simply want to recreate. Why was the fence put up in the first place? How did we miss a like that? Why in the world would we have done something like that? And all of these sort of issues. One other point, and I know Tara's going to ask you a quick question, but man, again, I gotta say, I appreciate your comment on using the word people. I've been trying to say the last few years, one of my banes in the planning world is, it's as if everybody goes to the national conference and then goes home for the next year and uses a term that they heard over and over and over again at the conference, right? To me, there are a couple of them. One is toolkit. If I never hear the word toolkit in my life again, I'm good. But the other one I keep hearing is the word community. And in its proper context, it works perfectly fine. But to me, I feel like it's overused, and what is not used in its place that should be is exactly what you said: people. Humanize it, right? Stop talking about everything in a big broad context, and remember that what we're doing is for people that live in the community, right? So anyway, soapbox, sorry, but Tara, go ahead.
No, thank you. And so, Charles, I like what you said before about like planning and why we get into this. So, because I do have my AICP, and I know it's different from when you're studying for the exam before and then after, you are bound by those ethical standards. But overall, in planning, what are some of the subtle indicators of how the bias works its way into planning?
Some of the subtle indicators of how bias works within planning.
Mm-hmm.
One is this: language. We have a language bias in this country. We're predominantly English-speaking Americans, and unfortunately, we practice that to the detriment of all people, regardless of their national origin. We don't make our meetings more inclusive enough to respect language and the lack of literacy in our communities. So that's one way that bias shows up. Another way is male bias. We dominate, and I don't want to falsely equate that of a Black male with that of a white male, knowing historically that we haven't had access to the same power. But when you're doing a comparison across genders, certainly the male dynamic is a bias that is harmful to women, those identifying as women, and others, in the way that we design our streets, in the way that we facilitate in our meetings, and in the terms that we use, or the language that we use to explain our field. It is very male dominant. Another bias we have is the sort of, I would say, autocentric dominance. And so this usually doesn't come up right away because we're thinking, well, like myself, we're biped planners. But here's the truth about biped planners or active transportation planners: the majority of them drive cars.
Yeah.
Also, when you look at the reason why people are dying on our streets, when you take that into consideration, the majority of planners who practice active transportation drive cars. The majority of engineers who design our streets drive cars. The majority of law enforcement who police those streets drive cars. The majority of professors who teach about planning drive cars. And not only that, the majority of journalists who write about it drive cars. I don't know what more bias I can demonstrate here, but there's a ton of bias, and it's impacting all of us.
Yeah, no, I mean, for Tara's episode where she was on a couple weeks ago, Chris brought up the basic thing of, planners that don't ride transit yet are out there, developing goals and things around it. So yeah, we've definitely explored that topic. I know that's making Chris's heart go pitter pat.
And here's another piece to that. When you think about the racial bias piece, one of the most unfortunate things I've witnessed in our industry is that, to Chris's point, I'm tired of hearing the term toolkit. I'm tired of hearing guidebook. But one thing we don't talk about is how, when we think best practice, most of them come from Europe.
Yeah.
Most of the things that we talk about as a best practice comes from Europe. It's not wrong with it if it's successful in Europe. But again, this is a different context. And I think planners have an issue collectively with the importance of context. You can't just take something from another country and bring it here and think it's going to fit or work. We have a history here that's unlike history across the rest of the world. And so I need them to be more mindful of that. And that goes back to Jessica's question about what I need them to know in Black History Month, is that in the context of planning, Black matters. You need to understand Black people. You need to understand their needs, their behaviors, their challenges, and their history here in America, so that contextually you can incorporate that history in your decision making.
Yeah, that's right. So I've got one last question for you, Charles. I really appreciate you being here. We have not given you any softball questions. Those are coming in the lightning round. But my last question for you is, we have talked a lot about things that just, are hard to talk about with our profession and things that we struggle with as a profession. What I want to know is, why are you currently optimistic about the future of the planning profession and environmental justice?
Why shouldn't I be?
Thank you. That's a great answer.
I mean, why shouldn't I be? I mean, why are we allowing, I don't let the hypnotic rhythms of society dictate mine. I'm gonna be optimistic because I'm alive, I'm healthy, and I'm blessed. And most importantly, I know that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it certainly bends towards justice. And so in the end, we will achieve justice. So time is our friend.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, who's kicking off this lightning round?
Man,
I gotta-
that's some good stuff. Go ahead, Jess, if you got one.
I have one. All right.
All
I'm
right,
so
go
excited
for
about
it.
this. Okay, so you went from Mississippi to Florida, and now you're up in New Jersey, and I gotta know, what Southern casserole do you miss the most?
Southern casserole.
Or dish. I mean, that's
Maybe
No.
he doesn't.
I'm talking about church
Anything.
casserole
Oh.
after the funeral. Which one? I mean, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. For the record, I don't attend funerals. I try not to attend my own. But in terms of, maybe that's why I'm missing the dishes post funeral. But I miss my my mother's banana pudding. I really miss my mother's banana pudding.
Oh, that's good. That's good. She made it with Nilla wafers.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's
And the
So-
bananas, I like it when the bananas go kind of bad too. It tastes
yeah. I'm hungry now. I don't even like sweets. That's the best.
So a few years ago, I was in a thrift store and found this book called The Engineer's Manual. And in it says 1926-27 State Highway Department, Jackson, Mississippi. True or false?
Wow.
They're still using that there. True or false?
From a betting man, I would say true.
When I see these, I think like, oh, the 20s. Well, we probably were actually doing better from like a pedestrian standpoint than we progressed to in the next few decades.
Stay off of Mississippi now, Don. I love Mississippi.
No, I do. Yeah.
Can't be joking, Mississippi. All
We
right.
love Mississippi.
Where was your favorite place you went while you were in the military?
Favorite place, most memorable place was Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
What stuck out?
Yeah.
It was the first time where I'd gone to school with mostly Black people. And my battle buddy was from some part of Minnesota, and two other friends within the military close by were from like Washington, places where you don't encounter a lot of Black people. And it was really fascinating to see them watch me all night. So I would kind of play games with them to see if they were nervous or scared. But it was really my first time interacting so intimately with people of another race in that matter, and love those guys to this day. So it really shaped me.
Awesome. Have a quick question. As a fellow member of the Divine Nine, Pink Lip should be a dead giveaway to what I am.
Absolutely.
But question, what is the best HBCU from your opinion?
Oh, without question, Jackson State University.
Okay.
Okay. FAMU alumni here, but it's okay. I'll give
I
it
say
to you.
now debate, right?
We respect FAMU. That was going to be my number 1B.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd go the Walter Payton connection, and with Deion Sanders and the success there, I might be siding with Charles on
Well,
that
I
one
mean, the reason
versus the
why-
marching band conversation we had earlier on
Right.
Tara.
No, FAMU, I represent FAMU, but I think it was Faulkner who said, to understand the world, you must first understand a place like Mississippi. So FAMU would be second.
What's best lesson learned of your own podcast? What did you not expect going into that maybe you come out and go,
I see
"Man,
what you're doing there, Chris. You're mining for
Best
advice.
lesson
yeah.
learned? Yes. Finance your own initiatives.
Mm,
Yes.
I liked it. I like it.
Did y'all hear that? I just want to know if
Yeah,
y'all heard
something
that.
we've been talking about.
We've been talking a lot about it.
Okay, last one from me, Charles. What is the quote that you live by?
Good one.
Mine is
Birds. Go ahead. No, you go
no,
first.
mine is
ladies
what's
first.
popular is not what's popular is not always right. What's right isn't always popular. That's mine.
Oh, I love that. That's going to become my new favorite one. But for me, birds born in a cage think flying is an illness. Fly
Yeah.
anyway.
I like it. All right. Well, Charles, before we let you go, can you share with our audience the details of your podcast and your website? We'll be certain to share all of those on the details of both of our outlets as well.
Yeah, everyone, if you want to listen to a podcast that is not controlled by any sponsors, where the people work to put people first and to tackle some of the most challenging topics of our time, please go over to the Arrested Mobility podcast at www.arrestedmobility.com and listen to us on Apple, Spotify, and all the other places where you'll find podcasts listed. In all seriousness, though, please continue to support this podcast. These are great people, and the more we can come together, the better.
Well said. Well said. Real quick, in just closing, as a quote guy myself, I'm a huge fan of them. And one of my favorites is that mankind doesn't learn from the lessons of history, is but the most important of lessons that history has to teach. And to me, this discussion today and what all of us are trying to do is sometimes we have to look back at some things that may not be that great, and understand why in order for us to be better. And I hope that the last hour, for everybody who's listening, certainly I know for me, I appreciate this frank and honest discussion, will shed light on some of those things, and we can get rid of the dang word toolkit, for crying out loud, if nothing else.
I was
right?
going to say, I wrote it down that my new quote is what Charles said, is I need warriors willing to risk it all for other people. And I know I've
Yeah, there
certainly
you go.
gotten in trouble for attempting to do that. And but I can say I do try and try to do better at that. But
Perfect.
I love that comment.
All right. Well, Tara Crawford, thank you for joining us and stepping in and being our fourth commissioner. That's the first time we've done that, and we
Thank
appreciate
you.
you
Y'all have a
doing
good
that.
one. And
yeah,
happy
You
Black
too.
History Month.
there you
Same
go.
to
There
you.
you go.
All right. Bye. y'all.
Charles, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. What a good discussion. Thank you so
That
much
was
for your
great.
time. All right.
Thank
Okay.
you.
For everybody who's listening in, thank you. And we'll tune in next time and keep on doing our thing. So appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Commissioner Danley here. Would you like to see more? Hear more? Well, we got you covered. Go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. It's got everything you want. Guests, yep, past episodes, the video, the audio, even our whiskey pairing, links to everything about all the people we've had on, books, websites, you name it. It's unbelievable. You want to reach out to us? Please. We'd be more than happy to chat. You can email us, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. You want to tweet at us? Go for it, @planningcommish. We're also on YouTube with the Planning Commission Podcast channel, Facebook. Heck, send us a carrier pigeon if you need to. We'd love to hear from you about ideas, guests, you name it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it. We'll keep doing our thing. You keep doing yours. Have a good one.